You stand on the shore of the ocean watching the tide come in. You sense the call of the sea beckoning to take you further. You step forward little by little, not knowing what to expect, but expecting more. You keep going as the ocean calls you to enter in to deeper waters.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Deeper Waters podcast. I am Nick Peters, your host, seeking to bring you the very best in Christian scholarship and apologetics. And today, we're talking about the future and we're talking about the past at the same time. How can that be? Well, because we're discussing eschatology, the study of final things. But we're also looking and saying, could some of these final things have been in the past? And even if you don't agree with that view, there's still a lot of history to be learned. The main figure we're going to be looking at in the past is Nero. Now, if you know your Roman history, you know Nero was a bit of a monster in his time. He was the emperor of Rome who had his own mother killed. For instance, I think it's even said that when the executioners came for her, she said, "Strike my womb because it bore a Nero." And for people in my eschatological persuasion, orthodox Preterism, we can often look at Nero as the beast, as described in the book of Revelation. But what kind of man was Nero? How did he live his life? Well, to discuss that, I've brought on Brian Godawa, who's written a book about end times Bible prophecy recently, but to go along with it, he's writing a trilogy. I don't know if parts 2 or 3 are out now, but part 1 is out now, and it's Tyrant, Rise of the Beast, about Nero. My guest is Brian Godawa. He's an award-winning Hollywood screenwriter to End All Wars, a controversial movie and culture blogger, Godawa.com, Godawa, an internationally known teacher on faith, worldviews, and storytelling, Hollywood Worldviews, an Amazon best-selling author of biblical fiction, Chronicles of the Nephilim, and provocative theology, God Against the Gods. His obsession with God, movies, and worldviews results in theological storytelling that blows your mind while inspiring your soul, and he's not exaggerating. Well, that's all him saying that. I just read it straight from what he sent me, so I want you to know it's his point. So, as you know on this show, I hold my guest's feet to the fire, so we're going to see if that's the case. Oh, now, Brian, welcome to the Deeper Waters podcast.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
If my audience doesn't know about you, tell us a little bit about how you got to be doing what you're doing.
Yeah, well, I became a Christian when I was in high school, and so I always had a love to make movies, and I finally did make my first movie back in 2001, which was called To End All Wars, and it starred Kiefer Sutherland, and I really love that one. I'm proud of it, and if people haven't seen it, it's on Amazon. You should check it out. It's a true story of World War II, true story, and it deals a lot with the suffering under the Japanese Imperial Army in war camps during World War II, but it also brings in redemption and how spiritual redemption came through Christianity into the camp. It's not a Christian movie, actually. It's a secular movie, but it's got a Christian worldview to it. So that had been kind of that's been my personal dream. I've been, trying to make movies ever since then. I've made a few here and there. It's very, very tough to get movies made. And oftentimes there are, dips in your career in Hollywood where you don't get any work, and I had that I don't know, quite a few years back. Had a couple bad years and forced me to really start to say, well, what am I going to do with my time? I said I always wanted to write novels when I couldn't get movies made. Well, I wasn't making movies, so I thought maybe I should write my novel. And what's interesting was I had just written a script that I thought would be really awesome. No one would have ever thought of it. It's based on a Bible story, and I thought, wow, this would be cool because I did research into it. And And sure enough, I wrote the script and I went around town. It was real huge, but it was called Noah Primeval, and it was about Noah. And of course, shortly after that, I found out that Darren Aronofsky was making his movie. So this is quite a few years ago, and making his Noah movie. I realized, I'm not going to be able to. He's going to make it. I'm not going to beat him to the punch. So I realized, well, this was so cool. I thought that he would beat me to the punch. So I thought, well, if I can get a novel out first, then at least I can say mine was out first. So I went ahead and wrote the novel based on the screenplay, Noah Primeval. And that became the first book of my series, Chronicles of the Nephilim. And the basic heart and soul of that was I studied the Bible and just looked into this notion of the Nephilim and the Watchers. And I come from a Reformed evangelical background, so I'm very orthodox in my beliefs, and this is weird stuff, and but I realized that there's more to it than just, there's giants every once in a while in the Bible, like Goliath the giant, and they talk about giants being in the land of Canaan when they went to invade it. And I studied deeper and I found, wow, no, there's a whole storyline going on here that has a spiritual theme and message to it, and it's about the war of the seed is what I call it, which is the Messiah, the seed of the serpent versus the seed of Messiah, or the seed of the woman. And so anyway, I decided I wanted to retell all the Bible stories that had these giants or Nephilim in it and stuff, and sort of add fiction and add a little and show a little bit of the spiritual warfare behind the curtain that we don't see. The angels, demons, or whatever. This notion in the Bible that there are spiritual authorities behind territorial powers on earth. And this was something that was kind of new to me, but I found it. I discovered it in there through reading Michael Heiser's work. And, it's this notion in Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 10, and it reads about how after the Tower of Babel, when God split the earth, split the nations apart and the languages, he said he placed the nations under the sons of God. And the sons of God are these heavenly beings from God's heavenly council, and they're fallen beings. And in the ancient world, they equated the heavenly host, the sun, moon, and stars, they equated them with gods or angels or demons or whatever. And so did the Jews. And so they worshiped the heavenly host, it says. And so these were behind these false gods of the nations are actual demonic realities. Now, what that looks like, I don't know, but it's hinted at in the Bible. It's referred to in the Bible. And so I wanted to sort of depict that spiritual warfare, that this notion that these territorial powers, there's spiritual powers, that are behind these earthly powers. It comes up again in Daniel, right? When Daniel talks about, Gabriel's talking about how I wrestled with the prince of Persia, and that's clearly a spiritual being who is an authority over Persia, right? And there's these battles in the heavenlies going on. So that was just interesting and exciting to me, and that's what sort of drove the whole series of the Chronicles of the Nephilim. So it's kind of reads like Lord of the Rings meets the Bible, So anyway, I finished the end of that series with Jesus, and I was realizing when I was writing this that Jesus's parables and stuff, a lot of Christians think that most of his parables have to do with the second coming, whether he's talking about the dragnet or whatever. And what they don't realize is that they're not. Most of the parables of Jesus have to do with the first coming and how God was going to judge Israel for rejecting him as Messiah. It wasn't about the second coming, right? And so I was bringing that into the book, and I was realizing, oh my gosh, there's another series here that I have to finish. I'm not done. That's when I realized I needed to write a new series called Chronicles of the Apocalypse. And that's because I had studied I'd studied eschatology for many years, and I can go into that how I transformed in my whole viewpoint with that. But basically, that was the launch of Chronicles of the Apocalypse, and because of my viewpoint was that, like you had already mentioned, partial preterism, which is, the belief that most all of the prophecies of the end times, the last days, those all have to do with fulfillment of the end of the old covenant era, not the end of the world. And so I realized, wow, this is the book of Revelation. And, book of Revelation had always been very intimidating to me, and I tended to avoid it. But just so happens that Ken Gentry, who was one of my one of my friends, as well as one of my theological heroes, is just now putting out a new commentary in the Book of Revelation that's partial preterist, and I think it's going to be a real game changer in eschatology. It's a thorough 2-volume, couple thousand pages, and because I know him, I was able to get an early copy of it so I could use it as research. So that was a helpful inspiration in writing it. But so then I wrote the first book, Tyrant, Rise of the Beast, which, like you said, is about Nero, and that's what launched the series. So. But in terms of my own personal viewpoint, when we talk about preterism, and of course you and I are familiar with it, and I don't know how well your listeners are, but I was raised as a typical, Billy Graham type evangelical Christian back in the 70s. And, I stumbled upon Hal Lindsey's late great Planet Earth. And that was, Satan is alive and well on planet Earth and those books. And it really changed my life because it really made me realize, oh my gosh, Jesus might be coming soon, the rapture might be happening, and it became a sort of an inspiration for me as I tried to communicate the gospel to non-believers that, hey, Christ is coming soon. Are you ready to stand in judgment? That kind of a thing, and that was very influential on me. But something had started to bother me about it, as there's two things that happened. Is one, I in my interaction with other Christians, I found out these other viewpoints, and I had been taught that, no, this Hal Lindsey viewpoint, which is basically the same thing as Left Behind, and it's basically the same scenario that most Christians today promote, which is there's yet to happen in our future a 7-year great tribulation that occurs after a rapture. Sometimes the rapture is before, sometimes after, whatever. There's a rapture, there's a great tribulation, there's this man who rises up as a political leader called the Antichrist, and he makes a treaty or a covenant with Israel, rebuilds the temple, but then he, halfway through the Great Tribulation, he comes in and takes over and puts a statue of himself in the temple, and all hell breaks loose, and you have all the judgments of Revelation coming down on the earth, and then Jesus returns and saves us all, type of thing. And that was the typical view that I was raised under. But when I heard other viewpoints, I was shocked because I wasn't taught these. And I think nowadays, Christians know a little bit more about other views, but this view is just one of several orthodox views held by orthodox Christian scholars and godly men. But at the time, I heard preterism, and I said, wow, that must be heresy. That's heresy, because I wasn't taught it, and it was shocking to me. But then when I started looking into it, I started realizing, wait a minute, they're talking about this time period between AD 40, the Book of Acts, or AD 30, and the Book of Acts and the destruction of the temple that occurred in AD 70, and I was fascinated by the history of it. And these were the only guys talking about it, because many Christian end times people don't really talk about it because it's not important to them. But I started to discover that this event that occurred when the Roman armies came down and destroyed the Jerusalem and the Holy Temple, never to be rebuilt since, that this event was a major turning point in Judaism and Christianity, because in Judaism, it literally changed the face of Judaism from biblical Judaism to a completely different kind of Judaism. It's not even biblical anymore, right? Because they don't have the temple. They don't, and wow, that's pretty interesting and that's pretty fascinating. But also it changed Christianity, because Christianity up until that time had, been a very influential cult of Judaism, and Jews were, persecuting the Christians, but it didn't break out of that sort of subset of Judaism until the temple was destroyed, and that's when the gospel really went and flourished. Christianity really flourished after that. So I'm like, this stuff is really fascinating, and couple that with the fact that over the years I started seeing, and you can see it better when you live decades, but nevertheless, I started seeing that all these predictions that Hal Lindsey made and his friends and the new guys who took over, they're always wrong over and over and over again. And now that's been 4 decades or three and a half decades since then. And I can see that every few years, the prophecy predictions change. The Bible interpretations change. Back in the 70s, it was all about Russia. Russia was Gog and Magog, and some still believe that, but nevertheless, it was all about communism. Was the the monster of the Antichrist. I heard nothing about Islam. Now it's all about Islam, and some even believe the Antichrist is going to be Islamic, right? And if you look back in the 30 years ago, Hal Lindsey, all of it's wrong and all of it's been changed. They thought the 10-nation confederacy of the European common market was the 10 toes of the 10 heads or horns, the 10 horns of the beast, all this stuff, and it's all long gone. And now they have all new interpretations. So my point here was just that over time, I started realizing, if they're always wrong and always changing, it's really sensationalized. It's really exciting to think that, wow, this event that just happened in the news, maybe it fulfills Ezekiel or Joel or something like that. But the reality is they're always wrong. And it started making me realize, well, maybe, look, I realize it's logical to say that just because they're wrong in the past doesn't mean they're wrong now. But come on. When you look at the history of eschatology, you see this interpretation goes on not just for the last 30 years, but 150 years, and it's always wrong. You have to start asking yourself, maybe the problem is not with the individual interpreters, maybe it's the system. And so as I explored the preterist viewpoint, the preterist system, and I started seeing how the fulfillment of these prophecies happened in history, it blew my mind, and it transformed my understanding. And at first Christians go, wait a minute. And I thought this too. I thought, but if Matthew 24 is the classic, chapter, but if Matthew 24, which talks about the destruction of the temple and then the coming of Christ on the clouds, if that was all fulfilled, what do we have to look forward to? It feels like, it's a negation of the faith almost, right? Well, that's only because if you're only taught that this is the only view, and you don't realize there are other interpretations, you may be wrong, you're not going to be as open to that. So, yeah, that was sort of that, marked my personal transformation. I started looking into it, and my influences were Gary DeMar and Ken Gentry and Greg Bonson and some other partial preterists, And so since that time, of course, Hank Hanegraaff has recently become, or not recently, but in the last decade, and R.C. Sproul, obviously, key men in the body of Christ, and they've become partial preterists as well, and so that's kind of where I am now, where I realized, wow, this is fascinating, exciting, and I thought, wow, Left Behind sold 60 million copies. I mean, it's sensationalistic, so people love that stuff, but nevertheless, the power of taking an eschatology and embodying it into a story, into a narrative that's entertaining and sort of helps you see this is how it might play out. I think that is one of the most powerful things you can do. And I realized that really only one other guy that I know of that has tried to do this with the preterist viewpoint. That's Hank Hanegraaff, right? Write some novels that show how the book of Revelation was fulfilled in the first century. So that's what I started my hand at, and that's where we come to the first book, Tyrant, Rise of the Beast. And I'm already, deep into the second book. It should be out in a few months, hopefully. And I think there might be the third novel is, kind of the climax. And basically what I do is I'm telling the story. I'll just say the big picture of the whole thing. I'm telling the story from the Great Fire of Rome all the way to the destruction of the temple and the holy city in AD 70. So that's from AD 64 to about AD 70. So, and I'm telling the story too of how, we don't know much about the Apostle John in the book of Revelation, and there's a lot of conflicting, interpretations because we don't really have a lot of facts about it. But nevertheless, I try to tell a fictional story of what it might have been like for John to have written it in that time period, and as Revelation was being sent around. Because I start with the Great Fire of Rome, and in Tyrant, Rise of the Beast, that's where we begin. And because of the Great Fire, rumors had started going around, and they probably are true, but we don't know for sure. But that that Nero may have set the fire because he had always spoken about how he wanted to rebuild Rome in his image for his glory and call it Neropolis. And so people started saying, well, maybe he's the one who burned it down and killed all these people, right? Well, it doesn't matter how powerful you are. It doesn't matter if you're a Caesar. If the people start rising up, they're going to lynch you. So he needed a scapegoat. And that's where the Christians come in. At that time period, the Christians, were a small sect of Judaism, so to speak, and they were talking about, Christ is coming on the clouds to judge with fire and all this. So he put that two together and created that myth that the Christians started the fire, and then that's what launched the persecution that became the Neronic persecutions that we now. When we hear being thrown to the lions, the Christians thrown to the lions, that's where it came from. But he did a lot more than that. And I wanted to depict the reality of what Christians suffered, which, from my perspective, is the Great Tribulation. So the Christians suffering under Nero was the Great Tribulation. And I wanted to capture that historical reality as well as the theological reality and make it an entertaining story. And so the first book is sort of like a conspiracy thriller where, Nero is persecuting all these Christians. We get to see what happened, but he also has heard about this letter that's been written, and it's subversive of the Roman Empire, right? So he sends some people to hunt it down and find out who wrote it and kill him if they have to. And of course, the letter is the letter of Revelation, and because of the persecution, one of the reasons why I think Revelation is written in a very creative, apocalyptic genre is to hide from the unbelievers the true meaning, because it was very much damning and criticizing of both Israel and of Rome. And so that's one of the reasons why they use apocalyptic is to sort of hide it from them, but to uncover it to the believers so that they would know what's going on, right? So this is sort of a conspiracy thriller, story, and it's going to launch into book 2, but that's sort of the big picture of what's going on.
Well, there's certainly a lot to respond to there. I couldn't but think of a few things. First off, is I was having a meeting with my in-laws recently, and as you know, it's Mike and Debbie Lacona, very much biblically informed people, and I remember saying, I think it was for a Mother's Day dinner that we were having a few weeks ago, I said, I would love to get to be a prophecy expert someday. I seriously would, because I found that if you're a prophecy expert, you can write a book every few years, get everything totally wrong, and yet still be a bestseller and still recognized as an expert. That is just a dream position to have.
Isn't it?
Yes.
Hal Lindsey, look, this is a quote, and it's just, but it's also, we can sort of laugh and joke about it, but it's really sad and serious, because Hal Lindsey wrote back in the 70s when he's making all these predictions, and keep in mind, he was kind of the one that made popular, again, he wasn't the first, but he made it the most popular, this notion that the whole heart and soul of the ticking clock of prophecy begins when Israel becomes a nation, because that supposedly fills some prophecies like in Matthew 24, and we can talk about that later. But so the heart and soul of it, and so of course when Israel became a nation was in 1948, and he believed that when Jesus said, "This generation shall not pass away," well, that's 40 years, so it must begin with when Israel becomes a nation, and 40 years places it around 1988. So Jesus, the rapture is coming around 1988, right? So. And there are, of course, other people who made as equally exaggerated claims. There was a book called 88 Reasons Why Christ is Coming in 1988.
Edgar Risenat?
Yep, exactly. So anyway, but Hal Lindsey said, when people were challenging him, well, what if it doesn't happen? And he says, well, there's a split second's difference between a hero and a bum. And if I'm wrong, I guess I'll be a bum. Well, he is a bum by his own words. He is a complete bum, but look at him. He still has a ministry now. And that breaks my heart, because what that shows is what you're saying is Christians are exploiting these false predictions, and they're claiming we're not predicting, but then they say things like, well, maybe this is what this means, or could it be that this Ezekiel meant this? But in reality, they are making predictions, and they're wrong. And so if we were in the Old Covenant right now, these people would be executed for making false prophecies, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And yet, I'm not suggesting that we should, but I'm just showing the extremity of the seriousness of how God takes this and why it's very dangerous. And we need to address this very directly, because it's not acceptable that these people should be able to keep making these false predictions and continue to be popular teachers. They need to be rejected and shunned, quite honestly. Mm-hmm. And not all of them. I'm just saying the ones that are really getting out there and making these predictions, that's my perspective, And of course, they look at me and say, well, I'm a heretic, and it's sad, because you've got extreme polarization in this country already, right? Politics and left and right divide and all that stuff.
Right.
And now add on top of that, Christians too are becoming this heavily dividedness. Whereas, like I said, I hadn't really written much anything on the end times. I just studied it. But when I finally came out with these books, then I started being attacked by people who are Christians with extreme views. And again, it's really sad. We should be able to debate these issues and consider opposing viewpoints. And I don't see a lot of that happening, which is sad.
My own wife is a futurist still, and that's just fine. And I tell people we can't have this rule of how we discuss things in our house, because, she's also a young Earth creationist. I'm an old Earth creationist, but she likes Hugh Ross, and so that's fine with me too. And so when we're driving together or something, she'll ask me a question about, say, end times in the Bible, and I'll tell her what I think, and she'll say, well, what would someone from my viewpoint think about that? What would they say? And I will try and give her the best answer I can from that viewpoint. And it's not fair, I think, for me to go and say, I'm going to give an answer that's going to make this viewpoint look really, really stupid, and then she'll finally see that she needs to advance. And no, I want to give it the best representation that I can, and let her come to her own decisions. And she abandoned belief in the rapture, for instance, on her own. And right now I understand she's still wondering if the Antichrist is really a person, or if it's more of kind of like a spirit of sorts, and things like that. And that's the way I think it should be, that we can agree to disagree agreeably.
That's really noble of you, because I got to tell you, Nick, I don't think, and I really mean this, anybody I've interacted with who does not agree, who's not a preterist, their view of preterism is always been wrong. They've never, like you talk about, I agree with you, we should be accurately and fairly depicting the other side and look to the best viewpoint of that. And I have never, when I've talked to people who are arguing against preterism, they've never understood it, really. They've always had caricatures that were created by these, the futurists who have an agenda to paint it as a bad straw man. And again, that's really sad. So I find myself, when I explain things, people are like amazed and shocked, because it's like they really don't get the best viewpoint. And that's been my goal of the series. Here's what I wanted to do. I wanted to show, look, some people can get bored with the theology, or they can't get into theology. I understand that. But when you have a story that plays it out, it embodies that theology, or in this case, eschatology, in a way that can make sense to some people who can't read the theology. However, I know that Christians are very, in general, Christians do read a lot. They study the Bible, and so, they like to have things proven to them. And my audience in particular loves to read my research. So here's what I did on Chronicles of the Apocalypse. I wrote my novel, and I footnoted the novel. Now, this is not something you normally want to do with a novel, even if it's a historical novel, because it's like, hey, look at my research, But the reason why I did it was because I know that Christians are going to be reading this, and most of them will have never seen this viewpoint depicted, and they're going to go, what? That can't be? How can you say that, right? And so I wanted to provide for them, if you're reading the novel and you're going, where did he get that? you can just check the closest footnote and you'll find my scholarly research behind the viewpoint. Yeah, look, I am doing a lot of fiction because I have fictional characters, and like I said, we don't know everything that happened to the apostles, so I have to try to make up things, but I try to make it as consistent with the scriptures and with history, known history, as we can. And I don't just put citations, it's not just boring citation footnotes. I actually cut out whole chunks of arguments from different books and different scholarly writers in order to prove the point for those who want it, right? And so that's another element of the novel that I think is sort of unique, and Christians are loving it. And then secondly, I simultaneously released a second book called End Times Bible Prophecy, and that tells a little bit about my personal journey through my end times viewpoints. And then I also go through the Matthew chapter 24, which is a classic chapter on the end times, Jesus himself, right? Mm-hmm. And I sort of walk through that and explain the things that I discovered that changed my mind, because I know that there are some Christians who still love to read the theology, the eschatology. So I wanted to provide that for people so they can have it all or choose, that kind of a thing. Yeah. But for my money, honestly, in today's world, I think the novel, the story is one of the most powerful ways to really capture that. And because look, when you're seeing Nero, and you're seeing him do these things, and we heard Christians being thrown to the lions, but when you see the picture that I paint, Nero engaged in what he called fatal charades, right? And fatal charades was, in the arena, they would like to take criminals and dress them up as characters in myths, different violent myths, and reenact the myth, right? So there would be a myth of Artemis, the goddess Artemis, and how she would I can't remember the name, but anyway, there's some opponent who criticized, or some human who criticized Artemis, and I think it's the myth of Dirce, and so she turned him into a stag and set his own hunting dogs after him, right? So Nero would reenact the myth of Dirce in the stadium by putting Christians out, or criminals, but in this case, Christians were criminals, right? He put the Christians in the arena and set a pack of hungry wolves or dogs or whatever on them, and he would even attach stag horns to their heads to make them look silly, or wrap them with make them naked, but wrap them in an animal skin so that the animals, the wild dogs or the wolves, would be even more ravenous, right, and eat them up. And so these are the kind of things, and there's a lot more that he did, and I depict it all, but my goal here is to show people how truly horrendous Christians were persecuted. And in some ways, there's some similarities with what's going on now in the world. Christians are being beheaded. Whole Christian communities, churches are being wiped out. Whole Christians are almost completely pushed out of Iraq now. And by Muslims, they're beheading Christians. So this is happening now as well. But also, as we see in America, there's a growing rise of hatred and violence against Christians, and the desire to put them in jail for not accepting, for not supporting and celebrating immoral cultural things like gay marriage or abortion or whatever. And so, I still think there's a lesson to be learned as we look in the past and see how they treated Christians. Like, take for instance the phrase. There's an interesting phrase that Nero used to use of the Christians. He called them haters of the human race. Isn't that interesting? It sounds very much like what they're calling us today. Christians are haters of the human race, right? And why do they do that? Well, because when you demonize your enemy, when you call them Nazis, then it justifies you being able to engage in violence against them, right? And so if these Christians are demons and haters of the human race, well, then certainly it must be okay to engage in violence against them. So this is where it all begins. This is where it all starts to build up. So I think that there's lessons we can learn, as well as, discovering how bad this stuff really was. Why do I want to do that? Do I want to gross people out? No. That's the other element that I wanted to do in these novel series. I wanted to make it historically accurate. So I'm also footnoting history as well as theology, and I'm trying to make it very accurate because of the fact that I've got that sort of standard over me that saying, look, Brian, you're going to have to prove yourself, so make sure you're accurate as possible, right? Mm-hmm. So if I'm saying, okay, the Great Tribulation occurred in that century, well, that's got to be pretty bad, right? And a lot of Christians misread passages like where Jesus says it's the greatest thing to happen in all history of the earth, type of thing. And they don't realize that that's a hyperbole that was used in several places in Scripture. So it's a redundant phrase that Jews would use just to describe, as well as Josephus, the Jewish historian, who used the same phraseology of the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. But not only that, but the Apostle John in the book of Revelation himself, these are the kind of things that just would shock me and blow me out of the water because people didn't tell me this stuff. But in the book of Revelation itself, John is writing in chapter 1, verse 9, and he says, I, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation. So he's saying right there in the first century, probably in the 60s, he's saying, I am your partner in the tribulation right now. So that great tribulation Jesus talked about, we see in the Scripture itself saying it was going on at that time. And so when you see Scripture saying that these prophecies are being fulfilled, you better listen and consider the seriousness of such a proposition.
Yeah, I also was thinking that you talk about your movie To End All Wars, how I had Kiefer Sutherland in it, and I was saying, my wife's family was really big into the series 24 when it was on, so I think they would consider that automatically awesome at that point.
Yeah, check it out on Amazon. It's on Amazon. You can't. I don't know if you can get a DVD anymore, but you can see it there, pretty cheap.
Now, what I'm also thinking is that you talk about working in Hollywood and such, and I'd like to get a little bit of that because, I remember when my wife and I were engaged for Valentine's Day, our first Valentine's Day together. We went to the Percy Jackson, The Lightning Thief in the theaters. Mm-hmm. And the entrance to the underworld there is in Hollywood. Yep. A lot of people do have this strange view of Hollywood that everything that comes out of there is just absolutely evil. So, what's it like working in Hollywood?
Well, it is. I won't, candy coat it. It is very hard as a Christian, because the truth is that Hollywood is dominated by a left-wing, radical sort of extremist leftist worldview that dominates it, and we can obviously see it right now, right? In the news every week. You see celebrities and famous Hollywood people with extreme hatred towards Republicans or conservatives just in general, right? And so if you're a conservative and you're a Christian, you're pretty much the most hated minority in Hollywood. And that's pretty much what I am, a white, male, heterosexual Christian conservative, right? So, so there is a lot of hatred. There are people, I know people, and I myself have experienced where people would just they don't even know who you are, and they just find out you're a Christian or you're a conservative, and they won't work with you. And that actually occurred to me, and as well as other people I know. But I don't say that to be a victim. I just say it is a reality that coming into Hollywood, I had to be prepared. You have to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. You really have to let people get to know you really well before they find out you're a Christian. But even then, there is often a good chance that they won't work with you again. So they're full of hate. They're full of extremist views, and their views of Christians are oftentimes, they get them from other movies, right? So they see Christians as nutballs and, whatever, devious, diabolical people, and so it's sort of I say working in Hollywood is like working in a jungle tribe that has no contact with real civilization, because they're completely deluded by their own worldview. And they have no idea about what the rest of America is like, you can see this by the things they're saying and doing right now in the media, and they're bold about it, and they don't realize you're holding up the decapitated head of a president, and you don't think that that's completely evil? So things like that are going on. It's very common. It's all over. However, having said that, there are still pockets of people within the industry, and this is why I'm mostly in the independent side of things, because independent filmmaking, you find people who have like minds, and you make movies together, and then you try to get them distributed, and they're usually low budget, and they're very difficult, and you don't make much money. But nevertheless, that's kind of where I've ended up because of my viewpoint, and I like to do stories that communicate a clear redemption, and I'm not ashamed of that. And I don't make Christian movies, but I have written some Christian movies, only because they were jobs, and I can make some money doing it. But in terms of making movies in Hollywood, you just have to meet the right people, connect up with the certain small groups of people who have like minds, and you sort of weather the storm together. And that's kind of how you do it. And it's tough. It definitely is tough. But there also is a support. There are support networks for you, whether you're a Christian or even if you're a conservative. Because like I said, not to get political, but I mean, if you're a Republican in Hollywood, it's worse than if you're a Christian. That didn't used to be the case, decades ago, but now that's actually the case. So your politics are even worse than religion, right? So, or if you're just a conservative, if you didn't vote for Obama, you are the devil to these people. You talk about a religious viewpoint. Everyone mocks Christians or religions for having these silly, goofy belief in devils and all this kind of stuff. Yet that's what they actually believe about us, is they see us as devils within their own context, of course, of how they would define it. But what I'm saying is that's sort of the equivalent to them, Mm-hmm. So, it's real, but I wouldn't, I don't say it to be a victim, but it is a reality, and you have to navigate it, and it's difficult. But, we are growing. I mean, when I came to Hollywood, over 20 some odd years ago, there was only one or two Christian ministries that I knew of, with hundreds of Christians who were involved in the Hollywood industry. But I've seen over the last several decades, I've definitely seen a growth to now there's dozens, a couple dozen Christian ministries in Hollywood, and there's thousands of Christians in the industry, and there's thousands of conservatives. Just because you're a Christian in Hollywood doesn't make you conservative. It does in most of the rest of the world, but in LA and in Southern California, there are a lot of liberal Christians as well. But if you're a conservative, there's also conservative. There are sort of secret groups of conservatives who get together and try to work with each other and try to navigate the system as a support group, because like I said, you're the enemy, so you've got to be really careful in how you do it. So yeah, it's tough. And that's why, that's another reason why I've embraced writing novels, because novels allow me to not have to answer to someone else who judges or looks over me with their viewpoint, right? I get to write a novel and publish it, and I don't have to answer to anybody else, and that allows me to get right out to the audience, and I love that, and that's why I've written now up to 15 books, self-published, but I'm making a great living at it because I go straight to the audience, and I don't have to be answerable to people who may not agree with me, on my viewpoint.
Now, you're writing this historical fiction, as I think that you'd agree that's the genre of it, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, something I'm wondering as I'm going through the book is, you do have scenes where John, Peter, and Paul show up there. Does it seem like you're maybe a little bit hesitant when you get this, because you're talking about the very apostles themselves, and, you kind of think, am I going to get struck with a lightning bolt if I say the wrong thing here?
Yeah. You know what? Actually, Nick, I did have I would call it a sort of a sacred respect, a holy respect. And yeah, when I was going to write about the apostles, I was like, I did feel very responsible because, or I don't know what the word would be, but like I was walking on sacred ground, and I wanted to be true to them. But you know what? Something I've learned over the years, because I mean, when I started doing this, I started retelling Bible stories like Noah, Joshua, David, and I was using these, telling spiritual stories with using some fantasy elements in it. And what I mean by that is, I use the genre of fantasy as a means of showing the spiritual reality that we don't normally see, right? So, the Bible says there's spiritual warfare. There's principalities and powers that are fighting behind the scenes, but it doesn't reveal much about that, right? Mm-hmm. But I want to try to depict that, and that's, of course, that was very risky and sacred holy ground too, because we don't know what it looks like. But after I started doing that, I felt the freedom that, you know what, when you're writing about the apostles, they were God's men, but they were also human. Mm. And you're a fool if you don't think that they had that they didn't have weaknesses, human weaknesses, etc., and that they didn't joke around or whatever. It's the hagiography is what it's called, that tends to gather around religious heroes is not actually biblical, because the Bible does show the weaknesses and frailties, doesn't it, of great men of God? Oh, yeah. Why? Because the greatness does not lie in us, but in God. And so I depicted, in fact, one of my goals was, look, the apostles went around, they did do miracles and stuff, but there's also a kind of humility about them, like what does Paul say, right? Like, God uses the fools to confound the wise. Not many of us were great. So I depict these apostles as very human men and almost insignificant. Like Paul's balding. He's got a crooked nose or something. And he looks very unimpressive. When Nero meets him, he's like, this guy looks very unimpressive. And Peter, of course, was a fisherman, so he's kind of gruff. And, so I try to depict them as almost insignificant looking, at least before the eyes of Romans and before the eyes of others. They're expecting these great men, they did great things, but God did great things through them, Mm-hmm. So that was my goal of depicting them. And I just feel like once I started writing them, as long as you're trying to be true to this of what what we do know about them, that's the only moral obligation as a dramatist, as a fictional dramatist. My moral obligation is to try to stay true to the spirit of what we know about things, whether it's the Bible or whether it's a historical character. Why do I say spirit? Because spirit as in what you think it basically was like, because the truth is, every historical source is written by a human being that has a prejudice and a bias, and so whatever historical source you're quoting is still biased. So you're just relying on someone else's bias. So yes, it can be truthful. When for instance, I draw a lot from the Roman historians like Suetonius and Tacitus. But the truth is scholarship over the years has shown that they differed in their opinions. Sometimes they were wrong. So it's like, everyone in history can be somewhat off. And biblically speaking, since we don't know everything, since the Bible doesn't talk about everything, then we have to make some speculations if we want to tie connect the dots. And that speculation, I try to make it consistent as possible. But that's my goal. So it's, when you're writing fiction, this is why some more extreme, like the fundamentalist type Christians might not like this kind of stuff, because, they might feel you're playing around with the Bible, right? And, I don't know how much to answer them other than they don't even realize that the Bible itself was, yes, it's inspired by the Holy Spirit and the Holy Spirit uses it, but if you study the Gospels, there's different perspectives that give you different sides of the same story. So sometimes it's not even word for word. You can't, sometimes for instance, the very sermons of Jesus aren't necessarily word for word, because if you see them, the same sermon in a different gospel, they use different words. So which words was it? And I mean, if you are a strict fundamentalist, you have to think that the word is exactly what came out of his mouth. Well, then you've got a problem of the Bible contradicting itself. But if you realize that, no, they're communicating from their memory, the Holy Spirit's helping them, but it's still human being memories, and they're giving different perspectives of the same sermon. So, Jesus' sermon, Olivet Discourse, it shows up in the 3 different Gospels, and there's different usages of words. Well, that's because it's not about the exact particular picayune words. It's the basic message, the basic theme, the basic points that he's making. And so my point here is that you try to stay true to the logos, the message. That's what logos means, and the message, and try not to violate that. And then the added, fictional element that I have in these stories, like, I depict the spiritual warfare, like I mentioned, right? So Satan's going behind the scenes, and I'm showing Satan and his minions and what they're doing. And of course, we don't know what they're doing, but we're just told that they're there. So, yeah, I'm making it up, but I'm trying to depict what they were doing in relation to the book of Revelation being fulfilled. In relation to, like, for instance, when we read about Ephesus, right? And you read about the city of Ephesus, and Paul wrote a letter to Ephesus, right? And John writes a letter to Ephesus in Revelation 2, right? So when you read that, you see what was historically going on at that time period and the issues that they were struggling with. And you find, and so that I sort of depict, well, what would that look like in the spiritual realm? So that's kind of how I do it, where I try to stay consistent, but also be entertaining as well.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, in fact, about that, the Nephilim thing as well, because I'll go ahead with my own and say, I haven't really looked into this. I mean, that someone like Michael Heiser thinks it's crap. I mean, it tells you it's not some crazy theory and such, but I can't sign on a dotted line yet and say, yeah, I think the Nephilim is a true kind of thing and such, but Sam, I don't think it's very necessary for reading your book. I think even if you don't, you could still have like a suspended disbelief and such.
Yeah. But one of the elements that I do carry on into Chronicles of the Apocalypse is the Watchers. Mm-hmm. Now, the Watchers, which it is connected to the Nephilim, but it's a separate issue. And the Watchers is rooted in, I call it the Watcher paradigm, or the Divine Council paradigm, and it's rooted. I mentioned this earlier. Deuteronomy 32. 8 through 10 says, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, he divided mankind, fixed the borders of the peoples. That's the Tower of Babel. But he's saying these nations, who are the nations? Well, the nations are the 70 nations in Genesis 11, right? Because that's what the Tower of Babel goes on. And the 70 nations were basically, in the Jewish mind, that encompassed the world, because those are the nations out of which the sons of Noah came. So it says he fixed the borders of the people. This is God. So he's fixing the national borders, separating the peoples, giving them different languages. And he says, according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob, his allotted heritage. So this is this notion where sons of God are the heavenly beings of God's counsel. And it's, you do a study on that throughout the whole Old Testament. It's always a reference to divine beings. And but these are particularly fallen ones, because it says that the people start worshiping them. In fact, later on, in Canaan, it says that, Moses writes that the Canaanites were sacrificing not to gods, but to demons. So in a sense, they say, yeah, they're sacrificing the false god, but actually to demons. So there's a demonic reality behind the false gods is the point. And this Deuteronomy 32 kind of concept is the notion that, well, there is a spiritual reality going on, and that is that these nations that do not worship God, we get this in Romans 1, right, where it talks about how they refuse to worship God and they worship created things, and then God gives them over, right? So this is this passage where he's saying, at the Tower of Babel, God says, he's basically saying, okay, look, I just destroyed the earth with flood, and then you still unite in idolatry against me, so I'm going to split you apart, and I'm going to give you over to those false gods that you worship. You are now going to be under their demonic authority. So basically the nations are under demonic authority of some kind, and then we learn there's very little pieces of it here and there, but in Daniel it comes a little bit more clear. You hear about the Watchers, and you hear about how there are Prince of Persia, the Prince of Greece, and these were the historical nations at that time that were going to be one taking over the other, and he's describing this heavenly warfare of the Watchers and all that. So this picture is, and then God says, but I'm going to keep, for my inheritance is going to be Jacob, or the people of Israel. So God is saying all these other nations are going to be under these false gods, and they're going to be a demonic reality, but Yahweh is going to be he's going to be the authority over his people, Israel, in the land of Canaan. And so that's the sort of picture that goes on throughout, all the way into the New Testament, where Paul says we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers of wickedness behind the earthly power. So in the ancient world, and this wasn't just the Jews, this is everyone, they believed that the earthly powers dominated history, and so there were heavenly powers behind them. So when you had a battle on earth, for instance, going on, there would be a battle in the heavenlies. This is where the prophet Elisha prays that his servant would see that as the armies on the earth are surrounding Israel, he prays that God would pull back the curtain and show him what's going on in the heavenlies, and he sees chariots and God's warriors, because in the earthly battles they believe that there were heavenly battles going on. So that's the sort of notion. And think about it. It comes out in Revelation as well, because you've got all this demonic warfare and spiritual warfare going on with angels and demons and all this kind of stuff. And so I'm depicting that reality as well. So in other words, when Rome had conquered the known world. And so Rome, under its authority, it had the other nations, right? So all the other nations were under Rome. So when Rome came down upon Israel, it was like all the nations coming down on Israel. What does that sound like? Sounds like Armageddon, doesn't it? Because Rome was all the nations. And what was happening spiritually would then be that all those, since, my supposition here is I draw from ancient Second Temple Jewish literature, which admittedly is not scripture, and some of it's legendary, etc. But I use them as creative resources, and so there's the possibility that Satan may have been the watcher over Rome, because what is he called in the New Testament? He's called the God of this world. What does that mean? What do you mean the God of this world? Well, if they saw the world as the Roman Empire, which they did, oikumene is the Greek word for world, and whenever the Bible writers used that, they usually New Testament were referring to Rome. So Rome was the known world, and if Satan's the watcher over Rome, all the other authorities are under his authority. He's the God of this world of Rome, right? And so I depict these various gods of the nations, demonic entities, and they are together with those earthly powers. They are going to be also descending upon Israel in some capacity. And so that's sort of the picture that I'm sort of painting in my story as well. It's it's risky. It's speculative. Speculative. I don't know what the spiritual world looks like, the heavenlies. I'm just trying to capture what I think essentially, spiritually, eschatologically is going on.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're near the halfway point, so I have to remind everyone at this point, you're listening to the Deeper Waters podcast. I am Nick Peters, your host. I'm talking with Brian Godawa. We're going to be discussing his book, or we are discussing it right now, Tyrant, Rise of the Beast, about Nero. But if you're here next week, now, Brian did say something earlier about homosexuality and such. That's kind of going to be our topic next week. I'm going to have J. Allen Branshaw. I'm going to be talking about his book, Born This Way, asking, are people truly born homosexual, or is something else going on? What is the origins of homosexuality? So if you're interested in that topic, then come back next week. And if you're not interested in that topic, still come back next week anyway, because, hey, it's going to be a fun show no matter what. Now, let's get back to the book, and let's start diving into it. Now, I do know some of the history. Of course, I'm an orthodox preterist, and I studied New Testament, so it's kind of important to know this. And even still, there were some things that were pretty surprising to hear about, because I've never really looked too closely at the life of Nero. But let's just start right there, because, some people could say, describing Nero as a beast, and, an antichrist figure and such, where that's really nothing new, you know. I mean, we had 8 years of Obama just now, and there were people are convinced that he was the Antichrist. Now we got Trump up there, and there are also people convinced that he's the Antichrist. This has been said about every politician, hasn't it? I mean, is Nero really that unique?
Yeah, that's very true. In fact, again, that's another one of the reasons why I questioned the futurist view for many years, was precisely because everyone, in my day and age, it was, people said Ronald Reagan. His name was Ronald Wilson Reagan, and each of those names had 6 letters in it. 666, right? And then Gorbachev was the Russian leader at that time. He had a birthmark on his head, right? So people are saying, well, maybe that's the wound on the head of the beast, right? And it just goes on and on, right? So yeah, I've seen that too. But here's the thing. So you have to say, okay, are there any references to this beast that that may exclusively be referenced to some, because you can always, all tyrants operate the same way, and there's a sense in which they all look the same. Well, there's a couple of things that I would, to mark the strongest arguments that make me go, okay, the beast is Nero, and it really couldn't occur in any other scenario. Let me list a couple examples. First one is in the book of Revelation, and that is Revelation 17. You've got John's talking about the beast, and he's talking about the great harlot, that rides the beast, the great prostitute, right? And so there he's describing it. And Revelation 17, again, there are different theories, but I'm persuaded that like J.A.T. Robinson said, all of the books of the New Testament were written before 70 A.D., including the book of Revelation. And so I think it was probably, Ken Gentry makes a good argument, it's probably written around 65 A.D. or something like that, in the midst of, again, if he's in the midst of the Great Tribulation. So John is describing this 7-headed dragon beast, right? And all of a sudden he takes an aside to explain. Sometimes he just describes the imagery and you have to figure it out. Sometimes he gives a little bit of explanation to help you, right? So in Revelation 17, verse 9, he says, this calls for wisdom. The 7 heads of the dragon are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. And the woman is the harlot, the scarlet harlot, the wench of evil. And so, in that time period, and pretty much most all scholars acknowledge, when you say 7 mountains in the time of Rome, Rome was called the mountain, the city on 7 hills or 7 mountains. So in that time period, they obviously knew that had to do with Rome. So he's saying the 7 heads are 7 mountains in which the Rome woman is seated. So the entity is sort of a corporate national entity, and it's Rome. But then he says there are also 7 kings. So the imagery is not just one-to-one imagery. It's very fluid. The imagery means multiple things, and let me tell you what they mean. So he's stepping aside out of the vision and explaining this, and he says there are also 7 kings. Well, what is that? Well, what's the word king? Just so you know, the word Caesar actually means king. It's the same thing. So it's no different. So and they were under Roman domination, and the Roman Caesars were the Roman kings over them. Now, the word kings in the Bible is actually used very fluidly for other things as well. Client kings, even of the princes over, like the Herods were called kings. So, and they weren't kings literally, right? So it's a very fluid word. But nevertheless, you've got Rome, and you've got 7 kings. Well, what do you think that could be? Well, it's probably the Caesars, but let's look closer and find out for sure. There's 7 kings. Well, who are these 7 kings? And what are they? And he says, 5 of whom have fallen. 1 now is. The other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must remain a little while. So he's literally saying, look, 5 of these 7 kings that I'm talking about, that I'm referencing here, have already fallen. They're already dead. And 1 now is. Well, who was the king at the time of John, the Apostle John, the Great Tribulation? It was Nero. Nero was the 6th king of Rome. So the 5 previous Caesars were already dead. Nero's the 6th king, and John is saying the 6th one now is. Well, that's pretty clear that he's indicating he's hinting at the fact loud and clear that it's Nero, but then he says something else. He says, the other has not yet come, but when he does, it must remain a little while. Here, this is a prophecy. In other words, this hasn't happened yet by the time John wrote it, right? Well, guess what? When Nero dies, the next Caesar that came into power was Galba. Galba reigned for 6 months, a very little while. So here you have an example in Revelation itself where it's rooting it in a particular time period of John and saying this sixth head of the beast is now, right now is. So that's something that really strongly says to me, it's linking it to Nero. That's a very strong one. And then, there are several others, but the classic case, of course, is going to be the mark of the beast. And the mark of the beast, and I think some people have heard this by now, but Revelation 13:18, he says, let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for the number is the number of a man, and his number is 666. So, interestingly, it does not say 666, actually. This notion like that we get from The Omen, which is still one of the coolest scary horror movies in history, but it's not true. It's not a birthmark of 3 sixes. It's not a name like Ronald Wilson Reagan with 6 letters. It's not a UPC code with the number 666 in addition to other numbers. What that is saying is the number is 666. That's a big difference. And why do I say that? Because in the ancient world, they used what's called gematria, including the Jews, and there's a lot of examples of this. And gematria is that they didn't have Arabic numerals like we do, so their letters in their alphabet stood for numbers. So what they sometimes would do is if they wanted to be poetic or if they wanted to hide something in plain sight, so to speak, like with graffiti, they might say something like, there's examples of this where I love her whose name is 1012 or something like that. And, they literally have graffiti on the walls of this kind of thing. And they also have graffiti in reference to Nero as well. But nevertheless, so 666, what they're saying here is if you take the name and you add up the letters, which represent numbers, the letters will add up to 666. Well, is it really a coincidence that at that time period, and in no other time period of history I know of, I don't, not that I know of, the Nero Caesar in Hebrew adds up to 666. Now, and there's no one else who does. So it's like, isn't that pretty obvious that that's what it is? I don't know if there are any other characters in history that people have been able to make that work. I don't think so, but it doesn't matter because if he's making this argument right at the time when the one character in history whose name does equal 666, it's pretty clear to me that then that's Nero Caesar. And secondly, it says this number of a man. And in other words, remember how I said earlier, the Revelation is a fluid book, and sometimes the imagery is talking about the beast. It's referring to the corporate entity of Rome and its imperial empire, But sometimes it's referring to an individual. And in this case, he's saying, I'm talking about an individual man in this case. This is the beast. This is the beast I'm talking about in this passage. It's the man, not the corporate entity. You see what I'm saying? So yeah. These are just 2 examples. I mean, there are more, but it's just loud and clear, and even scholars who don't have a preterist viewpoint many of them will admit that that's true, that fits Nero Caesar, and we don't know anyone else in history, but they still don't believe it.
And what about some people who will say that there are some manuscripts that say the number of the beast is 616?
Yeah, and by the way, that's another strong argument for Nero because now you might be able to correct me on this, but my memory is not as strong on this, but I believe that in Latin, the name Nero Caesar adds up to 616 or something like that, so that the scribes saw this and they were realizing that our readers don't read in Hebrew or Greek, and so it's not going to make sense to them, so they altered it so that it would match Nero Caesar in Latin. I think that's what it was. I need to double check my sources on that.
Yeah, I think it is Latin. It's my thing that one of them is in Latin and one of them is in Greek, but you can get it both ways.
And here's something very interesting for you too is, and I bring this out in my novel as well because it's really kind of interesting. It's like, well, wait a minute, Revelation's written in Greek, and Nero Caesar's name in Greek actually comes out to 1015, I think it is. So wait a minute, that's not right. Well, here's the point: is John is writing in Greek, but he's thinking in Hebrew. And this is another thing that scholars point out is that even though John's writing in Greek, he's using a lot of Hebrew imagery and Hebrew notions, which is why some of the times the Greek in Revelation is bad grammar, because he's making it work with Hebrew concepts and notions. And that explains why at times the grammar is off, because he's doing it deliberately to communicate to his Hebrew readers, because though they write in Greek, they think in Hebrew. Very fascinating.
Now, that being said, though, I mean, still we can say, well, people have low views of politicians anyway, and Nero was no doubt a politician. Was he really that bad a guy?
Yeah. There are people who even say that, the Neronic persecution wasn't that bad, and and certainly, let's find that verse where they talk about. Let's see. Jesus talks about the Great Tribulation. I gotta find it. Where is that? Matthew 24. Jesus talks about the Great Tribulation in Matthew 24, verse 21. He says, there will be a great tribulation, such as not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And so people are saying, well, Nero and what he did wasn't so great that it was not like anything else before, was it? Right? Well, as a matter of fact, this notion of the Great Tribulation was, actually, let me see here if I can find it. I don't know if I can. I've got to get my Bible verses together. Okay, there it is. I'm sorry. Okay, so this phraseology is, like I said earlier, it's classic poetic hyperbole. So in other words, people saying, well, certainly, obviously, nothing like this has ever happened, that it's not been from the beginning of the world until now, and no one never will be. The Neronic persecution wasn't that bad, right? Obviously, the Holocaust was worse than that. Well, I would argue not necessarily, because though the Holocaust killed 6 million Jews, I mean, the Great Tribulation against the Christians, it almost wiped out Christianity. So as a matter of how many Christians there were at the time versus how many they wiped out, it was very similar to the percentage of devastation of the Holocaust. But my point here is that the phraseology, nothing ever like it, has been used multiple times in the Bible. When you look at the Babylonian exile, when the Jews first went into Babylon, Ezekiel 5:9, all right, he's talking about, this is to Jerusalem during Nebuchadnezzar's siege of Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. And he says, because of all your abominations, I will do among you what I have not done, and the like of which I will never do again. The fathers will eat their sons, sons will eat their fathers, right? In Daniel 9:12, he says, under the whole heaven there has not been done anything like which was done to Jerusalem. He's talking about the Babylonian exile in Daniel as well. So my point is this phrase of, I will never do it like it again. Well, guess what? He did do it like it again, right? Because Babylonian exile, when the Romans conquered, the Jews went into exile. Mm-hmm. So, and they conquered the city of Jerusalem and destroyed the temple, just like the Babylonians did. So if you believe that this is literal, you're going to have to say the Bible contradicts itself, because God did do it again. But it's not, because it's poetic hyperbole. It's just simply saying, like I said earlier, Josephus, who was he's the only extensive historian who has written about the siege of AD 70, and he actually participated in it. He was on the Roman side because he got captured.
And he's in your novel.
And what?
And he's in your novel.
Right, he's in my novel as well. Josephus ends up in my novel. Well, he writes about the AD 70 siege in his book, and he says, in the very, very beginning, the preface, like I think almost the first sentence, he says, whereas the war which the Jews made with the Romans hath been the greatest of all those, not only that has been in our times, but in a manner of those that were ever heard of. See, he says that the multitude of those that perished exceeded all the destructions that either men or God ever brought upon the world. Okay, Josephus isn't scripture, but what's the point? Ancient Jews, he's a Jew of the same time period as the New Testament. They all think and use the same kind of language. It's excessive hyperbole to describe what? A deeply spiritually significant event. It's so important, significant. It's so significant spiritually that they describe it with this extreme hyperbole. But nevertheless, going back literally to the specifics of Nero, what did Nero actually do? It's interesting. A lot of people have depicted him like in movies in the past as like a madman, like, oh, he's, fiddling while Rome burns. And that was actually a statement that was made that was more of a satirical jab at him. What was actually happening was at the time that Rome went on fire, Nero was in a town about 40 miles south. He was engaged in a music competition because he was what's called an aesthete. An aesthete is, basically a person who worships creativity and thinks that the world will be saved through art, right? The world will be saved through beauty, through creativity. And so he fancied himself, Nero, I don't think Nero was a madman, doing crazy things. He was very, very calculated, and he did evil, great evil. But his motivation was because he believed that beauty was far greater than anything else, and so he sought to become a artist. But in that pursuit of beauty, he had no concern for the value of human dignity and human beings and such, and that. So to him, like I said, for him to destroy Rome and wipe it out and rebuild it, he didn't care how that affected other people, because he's thinking about his glory. He's a god, right? And there are many examples and cases in historical documentation of Nero considered himself to be like Apollo. He had blonde hair, and Apollo was his patron deity, and he considered himself a god. We see examples on coins where it talks about how Nero Caesar was called the Son of God, right? And there was even passages that talked about Augustus, the second emperor of Rome, talked about Augustus as bringing good news, the same good news that the Bible uses, right? That Caesar brought good news of salvation to the world. And so in a very real sense, for the New Testament writers to be using the phrases, Savior, Son of God, good news, they were also subversive against the Roman Empire and the Roman emperor. And so Nero thought of himself as a god. Therefore, he justified whatever he did. He would ride his chariot through the arena because one of the things he wanted to be was a charioteer. Why? Because Apollo was a charioteer. However, what's interesting is at that time period, the other powerful people who ruled the country thought that it was foolish of him to ride a chariot and to play music and all this, because to them, the artist, the charioteer, the sportsman, that kind of thing, that degraded the glory of the emperor, right? Mm-hmm. But he didn't care. So he saw it as, no, I'm like Apollo. So he would ride his chariot around the arena, and he would post poles that had Christians tied up to the pole, and they had what's called the tunica molesta, which is the tunic of molestation, which was they would dip a garment in pitch, wrap the pitch around the Christians on the poles, and light them on fire. Mm-hmm. And he would do this at night sometimes. So he would ride around. These Christian torches were lit around the arena. He would ride his chariot around there, right? Mm-hmm. He would do things like, I already described some of the fatal charades, right? Yeah, so I mean, you could go on. This is a man who did do great evil. And there's a kind of madness to evil, but it's not because he was insane. It was because he was evil. But here's something else that's very interesting that people may not know about. Nero was also influenced by some Jews, and he may have been influenced by Josephus. His wife, Nero's wife, the Empress Poppaea, was known to be favorable to the Jews. And we don't know if she probably wasn't a convert, but she was definitely one of those that really had favor. And also, there was a famous mime called Aliturius, who was a Jew, and he was beloved by Nero. So he would come in and, engage in some, personal miming for the emperor himself. And he was also a Jew. And so he had the ear of Poppaea, and Poppaea had the ear of Nero. And then Josephus actually was probably in Rome when the Great Fire occurred. And he was in Rome because he was trying to free some priests who had been imprisoned in Rome for some matters we don't know. So and so he had the ear of Poppaea. So what we have there is we have the potentiality of a conspiracy, which I actually bring out in my novel. And that is, think about this. The Jews were always the ones scapegoats to get, they would always be the ones sort of blamed for things. They always have been in history, and the Romans would do it too. But now you have heavy Jewish influence in the highest office of the land with the empress herself, who's known to be very, very, to like Judaism, if not be one. And they have the ear of Nero. So I actually propose, and I think that this is a strong possibility, is that when Nero needed to find a scapegoat for the fires, his natural tendency would be to consider the Jews because they were always blamed for everything anyway, right? But now you've got Jews in influence whispering in his ear, and the Jews hate the Christians, right? Because in the book of Acts, what do we see? We see the Jews were the first ones to persecute the Christians, killing them, torturing them, running them out of town. And of course, the imperial cult was in all the cities of the Roman Empire outside of Rome. You had to show obeisance to the emperor by sacrificing on one of his altars. He had an altar for Caesar in most of the cities. Mm-hmm. And you would just, you give a sacrifice along with the other sacrifices. Caesar didn't care what gods you worshipped, as long as you placed him at the top of your pantheon, right?
Right.
However, the Jews would not do that because that would be idolatry, right? And so they worked out a special dispensation to allow the Jews, okay, instead of sacrificing to Caesar, you just have to perform a sacrifice on behalf of Caesar every day in your holy temple. So they said, okay, well, that's fair then, right? Which, of course, from the Christian's perspective, that's still idolatry, right? So, they're trying to offer forgiveness, an atonement for the monster of Caesar, the god of this, the god over, he was considered the god of this world in a sense, right? I'm not saying he was Satan, but you get my point. So you've got all this Jewish influence, and they've got this special favor with Rome. They're whispering in Nero's ear. It's very easy to see that they were probably the ones to influence him to say, hey, the Christians, look it. They knew what the Christians were teaching. Nero wouldn't know what they're teaching probably. Well, maybe after he talked to Paul, he might. But nevertheless, the Jews would be the ones who really knew what the Christians were saying. So I think it may have been Josephus and Poppaea and this Aliturius, this Jewish influence that may have persuaded Nero to blame the Great Fire on the Christians. And there's theories out there about that, So so there's just some more about Nero. I don't know if there's anything else I can think of.
Well, I like to remind everyone at this point in the show, I remind you that everything we do here is listener supported by people like you. And it's all about serving the kingdom, doing what we can to get the word out there in many different issues. You listen to the show, we cover New Testament, we cover end times, we cover morality, we cover homosexuality, we have marriage enrichment. We got a little bit of everything here. And if you're looking at my website now at this point, we're pretty much booked nearly all the way up through August. There's, I think, one more show that we can do in August. Other than that, we're entirely booked. So we're working to bring you the very best. And you can be a part of it. And some of you might be thinking, there's not much I really think I can do for the kingdom. Well, you can support this ministry, which is doing all that we can, so that can build up for your children later on down the road. Now, if you want to do this, just go and log in into my website, deeperwatersapologetics.com, and when you're there, you go to the side, and there's a link that you can hit. It's under Work Help Support for Work of Deeper Waters Christian Ministries, and if you do that, you'll be taken to the ministry of Risen Jesus. Have you come to the right place? Yes, you have. Let's keep going there. You can make a donation to Risen Jesus then, but then you get in touch with me, or my wife Allie, or Mike, or Debbie, and you say, hey, I made a donation. I want to go to Nick Peters. I want to go to Deeper Waters. And they will get that donation, and they will make sure that it goes to us. It will be tax deductible entirely. And you can also go on Amazon and buy ebooks I have written or co-written, are limited to at this time to A Creed for the Ages, the Apostles' Creed, and Today's Christian. But co-written are books like Defining Inerrancy or Groundless or God and Natural Disasters. And finally, you can buy jewelry. Now, guys, I know we have a hard time understanding, and I'm speaking of a man here specifically, I know we have a hard time understanding the world of women many, many times, but many of us do understand one thing very well. They tend to like jewelry a lot. So why not get something special for the lady in your life? Let's go to the jewelry store we have on the side of my website again, and you make a donation through my friend Lena Klester there, and whatever you buy, 25% of that goes to help Deeper Waters. So you go and you buy something for your lady that you would buy anyway, and you support a ministry at the same time. And like this way, guys, when you do this kind of thing, you can buy a piece of jewelry to make up for that screw-up that I know you recently did with your lady, or you can buy a piece of jewelry in advance for that screw-up that I know you're going to make with your lady. Now, Brian, do you have an organization you'd like to see people donate to?
Well, one that they might want to check out is called Alliance Defending Freedom. Alliance Defending Freedom. They are a Christian legal organization in America that has fought to protect Christians legally from the persecution that's going all around. So they've gone to some Supreme Court cases. They've been involved in a lot of court cases. We need to fight to protect one another, to protect the body of Christ. These guys are godly men. I know some of them myself, and they've done great work in literally, stopping the onslaught of the legal persecution of Christians in the country. That might be one you might want to check out. I support them myself, so.
That's Jay Sekulow, isn't it?
No, actually, Jay Sekulow is a different one. This one is Alliance Defending Freedom. Okay. And but they do the same thing that Jay does. So it's similar.
Okay. So do you have a website for that?
You know what? It's adf.org.
Okay. All right. Well, there's another place you go to. Now let's start talking about Nero again. People who listen to this show know that I'm a gamer. For instance, my wife and I, we love to play games together in our downtime. I mean video games and such. And I remember reading your book about the Christians in the arena, and out comes this big Egyptian guy that they had fight him, who's like 9 feet tall or so. Yeah. I can't remember his name right off. You probably know it. But I was just looking at that point, I was saying, Yeah, I can already see the video game coming out based on this. I can't believe I haven't seen this character show up as a boss somewhere in a game that you have to beat.
Yeah, his name was Gabaris, and it actually it's based on a historical reference. I think it's Tacitus, but or Suetonius, one of those two. And yeah, a 9-foot guy, and he was one of Nero's favorites. And he had met him, I think, during the time of Claudius, when Claudius was in power. So yeah, I bring him out, and we don't know anything about him. But he was a warrior, so I made him into one of the warriors in the arena as one of Nero's favorites. And yeah, I love bringing in giants into my stories. So I was amazed when I found that one, and I had actually found another giant in Josephus. During the time of Jesus. So I put that giant in my Jesus novel as well. So yeah, that was fun. But getting back to Nero though, which is really important, I mentioned earlier that he was an aesthete, right? He was an artist. So he was like, which is kind of like, on one hand, you kind of, you tend to think of tyrants and dictators more as military guys, right?
Right.
But, in a way, this is what I think is so unique about my novel and the series, and I just love it, is no, as a matter of fact, great evil can be done through an artist greater than you may even imagine, maybe even greater than a military leader. Why? Because the artist, in the name of beauty, can destroy and create so much ugliness in order to achieve his ultimate beauty. So let me, as an example, I think, so my Nero is kind of like a Hollywood celebrity. What if a Hollywood celebrity were emperor? And as we see now, all the vile hatred that we see coming out of the Hollywood celebrities, right? And you see how wicked they are with their attitudes. They're just heartless and hateful towards the very people who will actually, go and buy their tickets to see their movies or whatever, watch their television shows. And it's like, and the reason why they do that is because they believe, and this is the key to it, to understanding the evil behind the aesthete, is they believe they are above normal humankind. They believe that normal people have to live by certain standards, morals, norms, whatever you call. But because they are godlike in their creativity, they are in touch with the true ideal forms, as Plato might call it, right? They are in touch with the true truth that the normal common people don't understand. So because of that, they can live by different standards. They don't have to follow these standards that the peons live by, right? And isn't that how Hollywood celebrities live? Right. They actually start to think they're like gods. And so my point is that I think my Nero is a unique villain in storytelling, in that it shows something we haven't thought of before. This notion that no, actually, the creative type, the artist, the Hollywood celebrity, they could be among the greatest evildoers that can be on this planet if you give them the actual unfettered power to be a tyrant and a dictator. And that's what my Nero ends up being. So I'm kind of proud of that one. I kind of like that. Because I'm an artist, so when I go into the psyche of Nero, and what he's thinking, I don't have to go very far to dig than my own struggles, because, this is something that, maybe other people may know, but I don't know if they do or not. But as a writer, sometimes, how do you understand the psyche of a villain or something like that? And my argument will be, well, the Bible says that we all have the same sin nature. So in a sense, we've got the same potential in all of us that Nero or even Hitler had. Yeah. It's just a question of, what do we feed? Do we feed the hatred? Do we feed the violence? Do we feed this stuff? Or do we feed the good side, the old self and the new self and all that? But the whole idea here is just the human sinful nature is in all of us. So all I have to do is look in myself and look at the attitudes and things I've struggled with, and just sort of, extrapolate it or exaggerate it or, beef it up. And then that gives me the villain. And so in a very real sense, I know how artists think, I guess is what I'm getting to. And I know how we can justify things by our appeal to beauty. Like I said earlier, imagine the grandeur, the glory of Rome could be so much greater if I could just destroy it all and rebuild it. Kind of reminds me of that phrase I heard 8 years ago, we're going to fundamentally transform America in 7 days, when I heard at the election of a different president. It's this sort of like this view that in the name of creating this beautiful socialist utopia, well, of course I have to destroy what's there right now, but everyone will certainly realize it and appreciate the beauty of it all. That kind of a mentality. And I think that we live in a time of such absurdity. I mean, I would never believe 30 years ago when I was, a young college man or whatever, and I would never believe that like people would actually be arguing for socialism in a world that socialism has proven to murder more people than in all of religions in history. In the 20th century alone, over close to 200 million people have been murdered by atheistic socialist regimes, and people are actually voting in the American election and voting for a man who outright claims socialism. I mean, it's absurd. It's just utterly. I thought, like, wait a minute, didn't we already learn that this not only this doesn't work, but it's immoral and cruel and leads to violence and evil, and yet socialism is actually getting because in the universities this is what they're teaching the kids, and the kids have no clue, they don't know, and they're only being taught this belief. But so again, I think it's not that far removed from what can happen again if we let it, if we don't stop it, because all you need is the populace to have a socialist mentality is what will allow a dictator to rise and take over. And, of course, some people make that claim about the current president, but they're not the ones who believe in socialism, right? So to me, the danger would be when a people get fed up and they're all they believe that the answer is we just need one guy in there to come and take control and fix everything. And this is why I don't think anyone should trust in the current president either. Even if he's more on the conservative side or the liberal side, either side, anytime a demagogue can rise up and say, well, I can fix everything. Just give me the power. But here, that's wrong, and we've always known that in America. That's been obvious, but I don't think it's obvious anymore, because the mentality has become more socialistic. And we need the heavy authority above us to force. We need the laws and the judges to force everybody else to follow according to what we think is right. So this is the mentality that I think breeds a rise of another empire that we've got to be careful about. Yeah. So I'm getting off onto a political sermon. I better stop.
Yeah. I've talked to some of my friends who do apologetics with me also. I've said, I can't believe some of the arguments that I have to make today, because the things I have to argue for so often in the past would have been common sense so long ago. And one of the main ones I think of is actually this bizarre notion that men and women are really different kinds of beings. And I never would have thought 5 years ago I'd have to be making arguments for why men should be using the men's room and women should be using the women's room. And yet, now it's essential I have to do that.
I know, I agree. It's sort of like you almost don't know, wait, where do I begin? Because I thought it's obvious. Isn't it self-evident? Yeah, absolutely. But again, but I think that this shows the difficulty of I call it the insanity of evil, where, when evil takes hold of a culture, it gets to the point where it's completely irrational, and you almost can't fight it with reason, because it's like reason doesn't matter. So you're making your arguments, but they don't care about reason. Like science, they don't care about science. I thought we were a scientific culture. Wait a minute, I thought the big wrong was to be anti-scientific, right? Oh, those creationists, they're anti-scientific. The big calumny that you spread on other people is to call them anti-science. And yet, the whole gender movement is completely anti-science, and it doesn't matter all of a sudden. So, in other words, even in our scientific culture, it's becoming anti-science. Even in our rationalistic modern culture, everything's becoming irrational. And so it's almost like we have to learn to fight with new weapons. By the way, this does get me back to the power of storytelling, because I think that while I definitely, and I've written other books on this, by the way, about rationality versus imagination. I think we need both. We definitely have to have both. But what I would argue, and I know you're like this too, because I was raised on apologetics. I learned theology through apologetics, so I've followed it for years, but I've come to realize that there's a real danger in relying too heavily on just rationality and reason, because we're human beings and we have an imaginative side. And look at what Hollywood is doing. Hollywood culture, here's the key, is politics is downstream from culture. And so, yes, you can do a lot of changes through politics, but culture is more important, because it's the culture that changes people's minds, that allows you to make the laws. And so really the people who are controlling the culture have the most influence, which is why we have to be telling better stories. And again, this gets back to my motivation for why I'm writing my novels, is I want to communicate this theological truth that also touches on the political realm, the social realm, the moral realm, because I believe that there's power in telling a great story that embodies my theology, embodies my views. And that's what I think Chronicles of the Apocalypse does on many different levels, and why we as Christians need to become better storytellers, because if you tell a better story, you can win by telling a better story. Now that might make the rationalist in us angry. Wait a minute, that's not fair, but it's not necessarily wrong, though, either. It's like sometimes the person who does tell the better story wins, and it may not be it may be a logical fallacy, but if it's a better story, there's still power in it. And that's why we have to understand that value and to become better storytellers ourselves. You got me going on another one of my personal sermons when it comes to apologetics.
It strikes me that that's one of the problems we have in our culture today, is that someone could say, Brian, we are doing that. I mean, we've got Christian movies coming out more and more every day. And what I want to say is, who's going to see those movies? Other Christians. That's it. We're very good at reaching ourselves.
Yes, that's so true. But I have to say this, though. I have to say that I'm encouraged, because I've spoken at a lot of Christian colleges around the country and their film departments. I have seen that the new generation the millennials there's a lot of problems with the millennial generation, and there's some real significant problems, but in terms of the positive side of things, I see that they get it. They understand. They want to become great filmmakers, and they want to go to Hollywood and make Hollywood movies, but with a Christian worldview. They don't want to make Christian movies as much anymore. I mean, there is that market for it. But what I'm saying is I do see an upsurge of interest in young Christian filmmakers to want to make quality Hollywood movies, but to actually embed their Christian worldview. And I'm encouraged by that. There is a rise in appreciation. And look, my books are for the Christian market, so I'm guilty of that myself, but I've also made other movies that aren't, and my pursuit has always been to try to also tell stories that can connect with the real world at large. But let's tell better stories on every level.
Yeah, and part of what I liked about Tyrant, Rise of the Beast, also something you said earlier, that so many of the things that are going on, that the way the Christians were depicted by the culture and such, sort of think, wait, is this about ancient times, or is this about present times?
Yes. One of the things that my research uncovered was I wanted to show that connections. A lot of times you'll have in a novel what they call an anachronism, which is like you're writing about the past, but you're using modern language, or you're using something that they didn't have back then. It didn't happen till 100 years later, or whatever. In other words, things that are historically out of place. But and some people might read my book, and if they didn't know it, they might think that I was putting anachronisms in there. Why? Because I deal with homosexuality, I deal with abortion, I deal with issues that are really hot today. Well, they were going on back then, and the Christians were attacked because they didn't accept the homosexuality of the time period, so they were persecuted. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? The Christians of that time, or the culture of that time, engaged in heavy abortion. And we're talking, if you think about it, modern day abortion, you'd think we have these, high technological culture and all this. But a lot of the instruments that they use on abortion are still pretty basically barbarically primal. They cut up the bodies of the infants. They give them drugs to expel them. They pull a baby out halfway, leave the head inside, and then stab the brains with scissors. And that's called partial birth abortion, so that they can do the abortion and get away with murder. It's easier when it's halfway out of the womb, right? So they're doing all these bizarre things now, but they did that stuff in Rome. And I did research and I found out, and so I put that in my novel. I actually have that stuff going on in my novel. And I know people are going to go, what? That sounds like today. And yes, it really was happening back then. Abortion, in fact, abortion was so popular that's why Hippocrates put it in his oath. The Hippocratic Oath says, the original one, it's not in there anymore, of course, right? Yeah, but the original one says, I will not do any abortions. Another one of the things that they used to do was that when the Romans had a baby, if they didn't want it for whatever reason, convenience sake, sounds familiar, couldn't afford it,
or it was female,
deformed, whatever, they would just take the baby and they would do what's called infant exposure. And what that means is they would take the baby out into the forest, leave it on a stump or on the ground, and just walk away. Leave it to the elements, which of course would ultimately be wild animals, right? But Christians became they got angry with the Christians because the Christians would find out about that. They would follow them and take the babies and adopt them. And so the Christians were criticized, just like the pro-life centers are being attacked today by Planned Parenthood, right? And, you got the same thing back then going on. You know what? Human nature doesn't change, except with, of course, the Holy Spirit of God. But, mankind is sinful, and we just go through the same cycles of evil. And that's another element that I bring out in the novel is how much things change and yet how much they stay the same.
Yeah, and people just really don't pay attention to what was going on. Rome also saw itself as a very tolerant society back in the, hey, we're coming in, we're letting all these people worship their gods all they want to. But just like today, that tolerance had a certain limit. But, we'll be tolerant until, you really disagree with us, and then our tolerance goes right out the window.
Yeah, I have that. I call it ancient multiculturalism, ancient Roman multiculturalism. It's like, I think I said this earlier, where, that one of the advantages of Rome, one of the reasons why they were able to rule such a wide berth was they allowed people their own cultures, and they allowed them to continue to worship their own gods just so long as they added Caesar to the top of their pantheon, and just so long as they made some sacrifices to Caesar, they were allowed to keep. And if you allow a culture to keep its own sort of subculture, then they're happy, or shall we say, they're compliant. And Rome did that, but of course you had to add Caesar. And like I mentioned, the Christians and the Jews would not worship Caesar. And so they ultimately became the scapegoats. But like I said, the Jews got out of it because they were able to have that sacrifice on behalf of Caesar. That gave them special dispensation to Caesar, but the Christians didn't get anything. So what you had was, again, the same thing that we have today. Roman polytheism is the same thing as modern multiculturalism. All gods are okay. All gods are the same, just so long as you worship the state, right? Just so long as the state is the true God that just determines what's right and wrong. And because you Christians have this God that you won't bow the knee to the state, now we're going to take you down. We're going to take you out. And isn't that the same thing that's going on today? Absolutely. That's all in my novel as well, because one of the things that happened was by the way, let me address this because it's relevant to everything here. The mark of the beast, right? What's the mark of the beast? That's another one of those things that all through the years, back in my days, it was the UPC symbol, right? We're going to get the UPC symbol with the 3 6s on it, right? Now it's a computer chip. Well, guess what? The notion of being marked is a very common biblical notion already. And it basically, even within the book of Revelation, it's clearly and obviously a symbol of ownership or submission. It's symbolic. It's not a literal mark, is my point. Because in Revelation, right after it talks about the mark of the beast, it talks about the children of the 144,000 who aren't going to worship the beast. They are marked on the foreheads by the seal of God instead of the seal of the beast. It's a contrast, right? Well, that's not a literal mark. If you look back in Deuteronomy 6, when Moses giving the law of God to his children, he says, look, these words I command you today shall be on your heart. Well, that's not literal, right? He says, you shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. The very context there is clearly he's saying the law of God should guide everything you say, everything you think, and everything you do. Think, your forehead, right? That's your head, thinking, and your hand is what you do. So everything you think and do, the way you live your life, should be guided by the law of God. It's symbolic. So when he says the mark of the beast, he's talking about being ownership, being submitted to that deity instead of the living God. And then people will say, well, but wait a minute. It says that you cannot, let me see if I can get there quick. Revelation 13. It says that you cannot
buy or sell
unless you have the mark. Well, that sounds like pretty real world stuff. Well, this is where the imperial cult comes in. I mentioned earlier. The imperial cult was, if you were a part of the Roman Empire, you had to have this, this altar to Caesar in your town, and you give obeisance, all that, right? Well, if you didn't participate in the imperial cult, you would be economically and politically stigmatized. This is what was going on. If you look at the Revelation letters to the different cities in Revelation, like Philadelphia and all that, those churches, it's very clearly you get this notion that Christians weren't participating in some of the idolatrous stuff that was going on in each of those cities, and so they were being rejected. And so what happened is the Christians wouldn't engage in the imperial cult, so they would be economically pushed out. Mm-hmm. And even the Jews were fine. Why? Because they had their sacrifice in Jerusalem, so they were accepted in the imperial cult, even to the point where you have the guilds, and this is where some of the letters of Revelation come into play. You had guilds, like I think it was it was Thyatira, with Jezebel and whatever, and they had different trade guilds, and in order to be a member of the guild, you had to participate in the imperial cult. So the Christians who were not engaging in the imperial cult were not allowed to be in the guilds. They were economically pushed out. So this is where the mark of the beast comes into play. Is I think it is basically the imperial cult of Caesar that was basically marking you as Caesar's own, as submitted to the empire, as Caesar is your Lord and Savior, et cetera, et cetera. And so the Christians were being economically pushed out because they weren't participating in that imperial cult. And there's a famous book on this. If many people think that the letters of Revelation, the 7 letters to the 7 churches, are symbolic of history or something like that, but I think that they're very clearly referencing historical things that were going on in that first century. They're historical churches, and there's a famous book that you can probably find it free on the internet because it's kind of old, by William Ramsay, about the 7 churches of Revelation, and I think it's even called the 7 Churches of Revelation. But Ramsay, Ramsay. You know what? I think I have that book at my website where you can get the freebie of the PDF download. But anyway, he goes into the historical background of each of those churches in the book of Revelation to show that it was very historically rooted. It wasn't some kind of symbolic reference to history. It was actually rooted in historical churches.
Well, the Kindle version I saw is 99 cents, so it's not free, but it's close.
Close enough.
Yeah. Now, we only got a few minutes for this final point left here, but a lot of people will be hearing this and think that, well, surely, though, everyone knew that this kind of thing was wrong. I think people forget that the morality we have, it largely does come from our great Christian influence, because there was a letter you can read that a Roman soldier wrote back to his wife while he was out traveling, and it's sweet, it's affectionate. He's saying things like, oh, honey, I miss you so much. I'm out here traveling. I'm doing what I can. I hope to be home soon. I hope you're doing well. I understand our child is about to be born. If it's a girl, please just leave it out in the wild and let it die. Love you. Bye. It's written just that kind of style.
Wow. Where is that? Is that a book in a book, or?
I'd have to track it down, but it's an actual letter.
You read it. Gotcha.
Yeah, it's the actual letter, and people forget that the cultural milieu of the time, this was seen as morally acceptable, and no one questioned it. That we have moved past that point today, it's not because we're just so brilliantly enlightened and such, it's because we got a Christian influence.
Yeah, absolutely. And which also, one of the things is, when we're talking about end times and stuff, and I've had to deal with this because I've been on other podcasts with people who are futurists, and, they're kind enough to entertain our discussion. And, one of the things I say is that, look, you guys, just because I don't believe there's a future Antichrist and a future Great Tribulation in terms of the Bible, doesn't mean I don't think there are evil people who are trying to take over the world and that it's possible. And it doesn't mean that I don't believe that we should, we should worry about tyrants. It's just I don't believe that there's some kind of biblical prophecy fulfillment. But if you look at history, it can still happen. So we can fight together to stop these things. Like, okay, I don't believe a chip in the hand is the mark of the beast. But I still don't like the idea of a chip in the hand because that's a means of controlling you. The government can then control you, can track you, can have all your, I believe that that's a road to tyranny. So I'll fight it along with the futurist, right? Not because I believe it's the Antichrist, but because I believe it's tyrannical no matter what. And so when Christians who feel like, and I would admit, if I look around me, sometimes it really is easy to think that, we're on the road to Armageddon, because the things like we've talked about, the crazy insanity of evil, that things that are becoming so bad, and there's just no one stopping it. There's no one standing up to stop it, so to speak. Obviously there are Christians fighting it, but it just seems to be like this snowball that's rolling. And what new crazy thing are they going to stand up and command us to do, right? Mm-hmm. And it's easy to believe that things are getting worse, but like you said, look, in my novel, I try to make it come out that things were worse back in Rome. Things have been worse, and things get better, and they get worse again. So we have to deal with that cycle and try to make things better. But my point is, yeah, you're right. If you look at the mentality and the way they lived in Rome, it was far more Antichrist than it is now. And, get some encouragement from that and some realization that, okay, Christianity has helped. We've got to fight for it. We've got to keep it. Because if we don't fight for it, we'll lose it. And that can happen. But if America falls, that doesn't mean the whole world went to hell in a handbasket. You know what I mean? Yeah. Kingdoms rise and fall. And that happens throughout all of history. And we may just be in the downside of the fall of a certain civilization. But we can fight to protect what's right, and we can know that we can have draw some encouragement from the fact that it was worse under Rome. Look at what the Christians in Rome had to deal with, and they were a true minority, right? We're talking, who knows, 100,000 or whatever in the whole of the Roman Empire. Not even, right? And those guys were being hunted down and persecuted and almost wiped out. They were almost wiped out. That was one of the reasons why the Book of Revelation was written by John, was because they were fearing the fact that the new Christianity we thought was going to grow is being wiped out. And John's saying, don't worry, the martyrs will be vindicated. You martyrs will be vindicated. Jesus will be vindicated because he is going to come in judgment upon Jerusalem, upon the people who pierced him, right? And that's going to change the world for us. And sure enough, it did. So, the belief is, and this is something we didn't even address, right? The whole thing of the cloud coming of Christ and how, that wasn't the second coming. That was a judgment coming on Israel, because there are different varieties of comings. God comes in different ways upon different nations and tribes in the Bible. He comes in judgment. He comes in judgment. And then when Jesus comes in judgment on Israel, that's what the Book of Revelation is about. That's one of the, in terms of the big picture, people say, well, what's the point of Revelation then? Well, the point of Revelation is this. They're in the midst of the Great Tribulation. They think they're going to die out. So John wants to encourage them and say, trust me, you will be vindicated. Christ will be vindicated. Why? Because the very Jews that persecuted Christ and murdered him and handed him over to the Romans and are now helping the Romans to persecute you, right? Before the Great Fire, Christians were left alone because the Romans didn't even know who they were. They're just some sect of Judaism. So once that stuff was in process, John's saying, don't worry, the Jews will be taken care of. Those who who said Jesus wasn't Messiah, they'll be sorry. They'll be judged. Jesus is coming to judge and destroy their city and destroy the temple. And secondly, the book of Revelation is trying to make this point that, the old covenant will be completely obliterated when the old covenant elements, the physical, historical elements of the old covenant are destroyed. What were the physical elements of the old covenant? The temple and the holy city, right? The temple was the heart and soul of Old Testament Judaism, and God said that was done away with in Christ, but yet it was still standing. So that's why the whole New Testament almost, most of the New Testament was written because the Jewish Christians were screwed up. A lot of them were saying, well, Gentiles can be saved, but then they also got to become Jews. They got to follow the law. They have to get atonement. They have to go to temple. And Paul's and all these New Testament writers are saying, no. The book of Hebrews is saying, no, Christ is once for all. But you'll see, because the problem was because the temple was still standing, that heart and soul of the old covenant was still up, and that was causing the confusion in the church, basically. So God is saying, look, the new covenant is here, but the old covenant elements are still around, so I'm going to come and destroy those and obliterate them in history once and for all, to prove historically, to vindicate historically what has already occurred spiritually in Christ at the cross. So see how this makes sense? Our God is not a God of abstract theology. He's a God of history. So when at the cross, yes, Christ truly inaugurated the new covenant in his blood. But that time period of 40 years until the temple was destroyed, was a time period where the old covenant was fading out and the new covenant was fading in. And when the temple was fully destroyed, that's when it was solidified that the old covenant has vanished away completely. The new covenant is here to stay. And God proved historically what he was trying to tell them theologically, if that makes sense. This is why one of my favorite verses about this whole thing is in the book of Hebrews, chapter 8, verse 13. Paul, the writer of Hebrews is talking about how the new covenant's better than the old. Christ has a better ministry. The old covenant was full of faults. That's why we have the new covenant, right? And he quotes Jeremiah, behold, the days of a new covenant are coming, right? Then at the very end he says, and in speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. Okay, that makes sense, old, new. But then he says, and what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. Then he gives three statements. It's like indicating that, it's not obsolete yet. It's only becoming. It's growing old. It's not fully, there, and it's ready to vanish away, but it hasn't vanished away. Well, what does he mean? What he's saying is he was writing this before the temple was destroyed, and he's basically saying when the temple is destroyed, that's when it's going to be completely vanished and done away with. But it's not there yet. So we're in this transition period before that old covenant is historically wiped out for us. And then the clarity of the new covenant gospel is there. And that's what the book of Revelation is all about. It's that finalization of the end of the old covenant age and the consummation of the new covenant in the blood of Christ. Why? Because the heart and soul is this. The heart and soul of Revelation is two women, the harlot and the bride of Christ. Mm-hmm. And the harlot of Revelation is a metaphor or a symbol for apostate Judaism that rejected Messiah. Because you rejected Messiah, just like the Old Covenant prophets said, you are now a harlot to God. You have been unfaithful. You have worshipped false gods, right? You do not worship Messiah. You will be divorced and executed, and God's going to marry a new bride, the body of Christ, those who believe in Christ. And that's what we read about in Revelation 21 and such, right? And so this is where I'm going to plug something that's not my own, actually, but this year, the book's coming out by Ken Gentry, a Revelation commentary called The Divorce of Israel. And in that book, he makes that argument that Revelation is about God is divorcing the old covenant Israel that did not accept Messiah. He's divorcing them and executing them according to the dictates of the law of God, right? You divorce an adulteress and you execute her, and then marrying the new bride, the bride of Christ. What is that? That's the end of the old covenant, the beginning of the new covenant, the consummation of the new covenant, that is. In other words, it is here to stay, and now the new bride of God is no longer this physical Israel, but it's the spiritual Israel. It's the believers in Jesus Christ who are now his bride. That's the beautiful big picture of Revelation that places it in that first century, fulfills it in the first century, but then looks a little bit beyond that, a little bit beyond to the future, and at the very end there's a little bit of that. But its heart and soul is describing the new covenant and the beauty of and the power, the spiritual nature of the new covenant in all these symbolic terms, and how it replaces that old covenant or overthrows the old covenant, whatever you want, makes it obsolete.
Well, we've unfortunately come to the ending time of our talk today. And do you have a blog, website, and email way people can get in touch if you want to find out more?
Yeah, sure. Of course, all my books are in Kindle form, paperback, and audio on Amazon, so you can go right there if you want to buy any of them. But if you want to know more about it before you get into it or whatever, my website, Godawa.com, Godawa, has everything. And I wanted to make a website that's very helpful and informative and has a lot of great free stuff for people. So you could just look under, click the tab on my books, Chronicles of the Apocalypse. I've got free articles, free books on Revelation that you can get online right from the website. I've got tons of artwork that, I like to cast my novels, so I have pictures of the characters and stuff. And you can read a little bit more about the series if you want to before you buy it. But everything's there at Godawa.com, and it'll be really, you'll find it very helpful and worth your time.
Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to leave with the Deeper Waters audience today?
No, just thanks for having me, Nick, and I really appreciate your ministry and your heart for apologetics, and as well as just the things we talked about today, your appreciation of the imaginative side that I'm trying to bring into the apologetics world. So I really appreciate your support of that.
Well, I'd like to thank you for coming on. Hopefully we'll see you back here again some other time. But
you bet.
Okay. But I'd like to remind everyone that next week we're going to have J. Allen Branch on. We're going to talk about his book, Born This Way. Is homosexuality genetic, or is it something else? For now, I'm Nick Peters, and I'm signing off.